Want to get ahead? Tired of mono red? From best of one you fled. Now join us in Manifesting Dread.
We got meds for your dreads. Comment below as we walk through the recap of Duskmourn Week 1. Alrighty folks, this past weekend we looked at 6 major tournaments, compiling the 48 top 8 spots and condensing it into 24 different archetypes that made it to the top 8. That is some pretty strong diversity going into week 1.
Oh yeah, the bird continues to be the word as Gruul Slickshot claims 7 of those top 8 spots, but a whopping 3 trophies. Yes folks, that's half the tournaments that were claimed by good old Birdie. The gauntlet has been thrown down and we'll have to see what happens in week 2 when everyone's trying to kill 2 birds with one deck.
Dimir Aggro was next on the list with 5 top 8s, though not a single trophy. Unlike Slickshot, this deck didn't have all the obvious auto-includes from Duskmourn, so I'd expect it to improve as the archetype evolves and solidifies in the metamax, but it clearly has the chops to compete.
My sweet angel Atraxa continues her stay at the Tier 1 hotel this week with 4 top 8s, though again, no trophies. This is one deck that will take a moment to find its footing, as Duskmourn gives us 3 different builds to consider and plenty of flex slots to debate.
And rounding out our Tier 1 selection is Azorius Oculus, coming in hot with its namesake, finally giving the archetype the staying power it needs to compete. Now, Oculus only had a couple top 8s, but it took down one of them, snagging a trophy and keeping out Domain from the winner's circle. Make sure you don't overlook this archetype. When in doubt, buy the eye.
In Tier 2, we've got Mono White Control representing Caretaker's Talent with 3 top 8s, though no trophies. Nonetheless, this deck continues to grind despite weirdly utilizing no new cards from Duskmourn.
And Squirming Reanimator managed a couple top 8s, though no trophies of its own, as it adjusted to the new Duskmourn options. This deck continues to be the primary reason everyone is using 3 to 5 pieces of Grave Hate in their sideboard, so ignore it at your own peril.
Azorius Control grabbed a single top 8 and a trophy, highlighting the new Overlord plus Caretaker package while retaining the classic board wipe elements.
And rounding out Tier 2, we have Golgari Talent, which apparently decided that it could snag a single top 8 and trophy, but completely ignored the new set, as it changed not a single card in the 75 to include Duskmourn.
Over in Brewer's Corner, I'll be highlighting Boros Cinderella and Rakdos Braids, so stay tuned for some spice.
And I'll be showcasing my very own Gruul Delirium build and Naya Control.
But first, let's kick off our Tier 1 archetype breakdowns, beginning with Gruul Slickshot.
Alrighty folks, Akinari Shimo Kawabe, I'm sorry if I butchered the name, took down a 102-player tournament in Japan last Sunday with Duskmourn's release featuring Gruul Slickshot, so let's dive in. First and foremost, folks, Cacophony Scamp, it's back, it's back. Yup, and yes, Leyline is already proving out to be correct, because speed and free are 2 things aggro decks love. Now, there is an extremely light green splash with an extra land in the sideboard to help when the games slow down post-board, so that you can get those Urbrask's Forges and more reliably cast the Paw Patch formations and Snakeskin Veils. Outside of that, 5 kill mid-range creature effects to keep Glissa, Preacher, Zorline, Shieldred, etc. off the board are found in the sideboard. But what I think you really got to look at when you look at this deck is how fast it goes. Yes, it can win on turn 2, but it can also play kind of a chess match post board where you get the Snakeskin Veils and you just hold slick shots, out in the ether after you've plotted them and just wait for the gates to come down. It's a lot more complex than people think. They think it's going to be a deck where you just curve and pray. That's not true. There's a lot of chess math to be done with this.
Interesting. Really one of the first times we've asked aggro to do so much math. Definitely true here in this deck. So my question for you, how aggressively should you mulligan for a Leyline, really game 1 on the play, for example, versus being on the draw? Do you sideboard, do you mulligan more aggressively for it? Do you sideboard them out for something else in, any certain situations?
I don't think you're necessarily mulliganing for a Leyline. I think you are mulliganing if you have a hand that does not have the firepower it needs, and if you happen to get like the bonus hand where Leyline's there and you have all the pieces, fantastic. You love it when you get the free wins, but this deck doesn't rely on Leyline, it's just another piece, right? Like it was winning before we ever got Leyline, and I don't think that's really changing at this point. It's just a question of, do you get the broken turn 2 hand, right? And so I'm not mulliganing for it at all. Do I sideboard them out? Depends on the matchup. There are matchups where you really want that extra staying power, that extra firepower, but I think in general, as people adjust, as people bring in more ways to deal with it, you're going to sideboard them out so that they're sideboarding in dead cards. So again, you get into that kind of like poker bluff back and forth on like, what are you keeping in, what are you bringing out, what do they expect you to keep in or bring out, and that dictates a lot of how you board.
Okay, definitely a strategy to consider. That old tactic of making your opponent have dead cards in games 2 and 3. I love it. All right, let's talk about the next aggressive deck on our tier 1 list here, Dimir Aggro.
Koki Kondo made it to the quarterfinals of Japan's 102-player Is It Explosive Experiment event this past Sunday with Dimir, proving it still has a place among the best. Now let's look at what changed. A lot. I'm just going to start there. A lot has changed, and I love where it went. Okay, Unstoppable Slasher. It's here. It's really good. You look at like Leyline Red and you think, it's the fastest deck in the format. This card closes games, and it does it quickly. It's also very sticky. Until everybody starts running exile-based removal, and we're getting there. We are getting there. But until they do, this card is going to be rough to deal with, and it almost single-handedly obviates Lily of the Veil coming down against you, right? So I love that. The Enduring Curiosity, giving you additional copies of Gix, essentially, to just tempo right through, feels fantastic. You have so much grind. And if you remember with this list, Max, we used to have issues grinding against mid-range. I don't think we're going to have those issues anymore. We used to have issues with Snakeskin Veil. We've got nowhere to run now. We used to have issues with closing out quickly against Domain and Ramp and Control, and now we have Slasher to do that. This deck gained so many pieces, and I love it.
I'm right there with you. I've been playing Dimir Aggro, falling back in love with it again. It's definitely shored up some of its weaknesses, as you've described. Nothing but love for the deck so far. But my big question, because I've gotten comments in the Rebellion and the Discord, talking with others about this combination here. Is it worth putting in Bloodletter of Aclazotz instead of having, for example, those Shellys in the 4-drop slot, so you get that double damage insta kill with Slasher whenever it hits?
I don't have an issue with it. Honestly, I think that you're running 2 Shield Raid up there, and I wouldn't mind seeing at least 1 shift over so that you're given that option, because that's such a damning option for Ramp and for Control right now, where you play a Slasher and they have to respect it, right? They can't just be like, we'll just keep ramping past it with an Overlord and we'll deal with it next turn. They can't do that if the Bloodletter's sitting there, right? So I think that's a decent argument alone to say, why don't we do a 1-1 split? Because it still increases your clock quickly. Regardless of whether you have Slasher going for the insta-win, it's still doubling down your clock. And I don't think that's going to be a problem. I think it's worth doing.
I'm right there with you. I don't think the argument dies to removal necessarily works anymore. You have to consider how many must-answer threats are in the deck. So, yeah, I love that response. Let's talk about this deck right here. Has 3 iterations. Talk to us about this iteration of Domain.
All right, so Luka Dusek 2 made it to the finals of Saturday's 42-player MTGO Challenge before getting wrecked by Azorius Oculus, and their build is my favorite, honestly. Zur, huge. For those of you who aren't aware of how good this is, this card's amazing. It was kept out because the Overlords weren't here yet. Now that the Overlords are here, this card's fantastic, because you get to animate these before the impending's done. So let's imagine a scenario where you go turn 3 Overlord, and then turn 4, you play an untapped land, you go Zur, activate the ability, turn this into a 6/5 that now has Death Touch, Lifelink, Hexproof, and when it swings, it ramps you again. Do you see how insane that is for a turn 4 play? Like, that is my point here. The Overlords plus Zur, fantastic. I love where that's at. And this build, I mean, it's positioned to outgrind everyone. The big problem I see with this particular build is, can you actually beat Slickshot? Can you get off in time? Because tap land. You see the problem here. So many tap lands. You're giving up turns against a deck that can beat you by the second one. That's rough.
Certainly is. And that, that's just natural tension right now in the meta. I also want to highlight Zur, one of those cards that when it first showed up, totally overshadowed by Esper Legends, or Esper Midrange and Rafine. But now, and a good example of how when the meta churns and things go out and things come back in, old cards get support. So I love seeing that card come back. My question for you, though, a staple for Domain, seemingly, why on earth are there no Leyline bindings in the deck?
I'm gonna be honest. I think it's a mistake. I think it's a mistake.
Okay.
You're playing Zur. You can turn that leyline into a 6/6 Death Touch Lifelink Hexproof. And let's remember that even when Zur's dead, it's still a creature. It doesn't have the Death Touch Lifelink Hexproof, but it's still a 6/6. That doesn't go away just because Zur dies. So like I think it's a mistake not to be running ley lines. Like if you're on the Zur plan, you're already on the plan of we're overloading enchantments and we're gonna have more enchantments than they have answers. So why wouldn't you run one of the best removal spells that Domain has access to? I don't agree with the choice personally.
Yeah, that's fair. I agree with you. That's a really good question for the deck. All right, but let's talk about last list on our tier 1 archetypes. This one I'm excited to talk about. Azorius Oculus.
So Makubi took down the 42-player MTGO challenge this past Saturday with Azorius Oculus, starting the coming out party for a deck that has long been sitting in the shadows waiting for an upgrade. So let's take a look at why this is working right now. I think first and foremost, as much as people want to look at Oculus like, yeah, this is working fantastically, it's partially because of where the metagame's positioned. With Gruul Slickshot being such a big piece, this card's amazing. This is one of the best answers that you can possibly have to them going, okay, turn 1 Heartfire, you go Island. They go, okay, well, we've got Leyline, we've got the turn 2 win, we're just going to, double pump with turn Inside Out, and you're like, actually put it back in your hand, Time Walk, and you lose the card for 1 mana. That's why that card's important. It's also important because it deals with Rest in Peace long enough for you to get an Oculus into play sometimes. You can just bounce it on end stepped, chart a course into Helping Hand, get Oculus, you're fine, right? So Oculus to me was the missing piece. It's 8 evasive flyers in this build. It's a great package. You have a backup swarm strategy. We're seeing Oculus getting played in older formats, which tells you how powerful that card is.
Yeah, I've been playing with this in recent days and having a lot of fun. It's just a really fun deck. And I like where it is right now in the meta. So, Haughty Djinn, we have seen Monastery Mentor in the list in the past. Why Haughty Djinn now? Why not Monastery Mentor? Why?
So I actually think this is a bit of a mistake, but we get to a weird part in the argument here, because if people aren't running Grave Hate, Haughty Djinn is better than Mentor. I'll flat say that. But I expect Grave Hate. I see Grave Hate at 3 to 5 slots in every single sideboard, in part because Reanimator's out there and it's making a splash, right? And if we think of that, I think you don't want the Djinn. I think you want the Mentor. And I get that Djinn makes other things cost less, but half your deck costs 1 mana anyway. And when you get to Mentor, you get to do the swarm strategy at a much higher level. You also get to ignore many of their draws where they're like Rest in Peace, and you go, I don't even care. Mentor and Swarm. Don't even care. You can do whatever you want. We'll just play Mentor with counter backup and play that game back and forth. The last piece that's worth acknowledging is when you play Mentor instead of Djinn, you don't have the awkward scenario where you have an Oculus in hand, 6 cards in graveyard, and you're sitting there like, okay, I don't have the ability to get Oculus into the grave and then Helping Hand it back into play, but I can exile those 6 cards because this deck does fill up that grave and play Oculus on turn 3. But if I do that, my Haughty Djinn's going to be a 0/4, right? There's a tension point there as well because you're exiling out of your own grave in that scenario. Whereas with Mentor, you don't care. You're like, perfect, exile the 6, don't give a shit, move on. So it's a tension point worth acknowledging.
Yeah, you raise a really good point there, and that's something I'm dealing with in my own build. Is I have the Monastery Mentor over the Haughty Djinn, so it's like, and sometimes you don't, you may want the Haughty Djinn in certain situations, more power a lot more quickly because of how fast it is to fill up the graveyard. But it's a whole thing, and this is the situation you run into when you have such a wide and varied meta, a healthy meta, I would say, like we have right now in Standard. So, these kinds of problems and tension points within decks are to be expected. So. Build appropriately for the most current meta picture that you're looking at regionally as well. But that's all that we have for tier 1. Let's go down into tier 2, where I'll start talking about mono white control. So Taylor Spain made it to the finals of Sunday's 41-player MTGO challenge with mono white control, featuring not a single card from Duskmourn. So where do we go from here? First, I just want to talk about Laydown Arms. Laydown Arms, me and Athena were talking about this on the Rebelcast. Such a great piece of removal right now for Standard. You love being able to 1 mana exile something. It's just, regardless of giving them 3 life, I think that's just really valuable right now. Get Lost is also a very versatile piece of removal, especially in a control scheme. You know, we talk about how it gives map tokens away. You may not want to do that with aggro, but if you're able to board wipe later and just stall them until that point, I think Get Lost is okay in a lot of situations. Plus, you also want to have the ability to remove the ever important enchantment. 2 copies of Parting Gust, versatile removal and protection spell all in one. I want to note the 4 copies of Rest in Peace in the sideboard, very appropriate for the time period right now. We are seeing Graveyard play heavily. And 3 Imidane's Recruiters. I assume that's for the more grindier matchups that you find yourself in sometimes.
Oh yeah, Imidane's has long been the tech to take down domain and control and just push right through on a quick turn, right? But I look at this list, Max, and I see cards that could go in here, right? Like Toby, Overlord of the Mistmoors. These are 2 cards right out of Duskmourn that seem like they would fit naturally in there. Do you think they belong to be in there, or do you think there's a reason they're not?
I think this is the answer to this is just the classic, players who grind don't want to change things that are working until they have a reason to change them, that tendency. But I think this is a missed opportunity. I do like Toby. We talked about last week how you could copy the 4/4 token, have 2 4/4s out there. You don't necessarily have to have Toby companioning that 4/4. I also might swap a couple of the copies of Beza here. They have all 4 in there for maybe 2 Overlord of the Mistmoors. Beza can be a little bit inconsistent when it comes to how much value you get out of the card in a given matchup. Whereas with Mistmoors, you kind of always know what you're getting. And even if you're just spending the impending cost on it, you get that effect twice in a game. And Control can do that. Control is going to be around long enough in the matchup and go into the end game that you're going to reap that benefit. So I do like these cards, and I hope to see in subsequent weeks they find a slot in this deck.
I'm right there with you. And I think they will. I think they will. And the point you made with Beza is perfect. Like when you're behind, Beza feels amazing. But if you're dead even or ahead, Beza's a 4/5 for 4 mana. You know what I mean? Like it's an upgraded hill giant, and you're just sitting there like, it's awkward. Doesn't do any of the token stuff if you're even on lands and you're even on creatures. So anyway, with that, let's move to a deck that got a lot out of Duskmourn, Squirming Reanimator.
Kyle Hitachi got to the semifinals of the 102-player Is It Explosive Experiment tourney this past weekend. Lots of upgrades for this archetype, so let's go ahead and dive in. We have a new tool, right? I picked this up in draft when I played Simic Manifest Dread, and I used it there. I didn't think it was going to do anything outside of the draft setting, but we have copies of Say Its Name with Altanak, the also known as the Candyman, right? Say his name 3 times and he appears. So interesting to see that new sort of combination in this deck. 2 copies of Lumra. I'm going to keep singing the Bears' praises. Seems very potent here, especially with all the self-mill going on. We also have a new target for Reanimation in Valgavoth. I think this is just kind of the new poster boy for Reanimation right now. Everybody wants to have this card out on the board. I also like Harvester of Misery here. You can do the discard on turn 2 to zap something and then reanimate the whole thing later. I also want to point out just a quick tech Coast Vacuum in the sideboard. This is kind of competing for slots with Lantern as far as graveyard hate goes, but I like where it's positioned in this Reanimator list.
So, Max, I look at this list, and it's got some of the same questions I have for Domain, which is, how are you dealing with Gruul Slickshot? We know it's the top deck. We know it's a speed demon. Is this deck actually ready to deal with that speed?
Considering the colors that you have here, you can take advantage of, providing some slots, at least in the sideboard, of Nowhere to Run. I've been singing this card's praises lately. Nowhere to Run seems really well positioned right now. Seems like a very intentional design by Wizards in this set. I love the ability to get around like Snakeskin Veil, get around, some of the ward things that you see in other color sets, but especially against Gruul Prowess, also into the Flood Maw, as you identified earlier. So you have access to both these cards. I say why not go ahead and give them some slots in this deck.
Fair. And with that being said, we are going to take a look at the Control archetype that made it through and actually got a lot of upgrades here. Let's talk about Azorius Control.
And 6310 took down Rapsilo's 18-player Duskmourn release tournament last Thursday with Azorius Control. So let's discuss. We have here copies of a card I really haven't seen before, Unwanted Remake. It does allow your opponent to manifest Dread. That's a little bit undesirable, as me and Athena have talked about in the Rebelcast. But those tokens that you get, or the 2/2 manifests, are targets for temporary lockdown later, also Sunfall. So it's not necessarily great that they get to do that. You know, it is kind of a bit of a tempo option here. We have 3 copies of No More Lies. This card is definitely putting in work this season, just because of the fact that it exiles the target. And if you're exiling their creature spell, that's awesome. They don't get to reanimate it later. We've got Caretaker's Talent in combination with Elspeth, the Wanderer, and 4 copies of Overlords of the Mistmoors. So you've got a lot of token generators putting in work for Caretaker's Talent, some really powerful ones at that. We've also got 2 copies of main Tidebinder in here. Tidebinder is still significant for targeting Planeswalkers. We're seeing heavy Planeswalker play. And also targets cards like Oculus and keeps them from doing their thing.
Fair. Now, Max, I look at this list and I see, a lot of card advantage, but can it get through a deck like Domain that's going to have Jace? It's going to have more card advantage than potentially you can even deal with. Where do you get through that? You know what I mean?
Yeah, it seems like it could contend now that it has access to all these token generators along with the Caretaker's Talent. I know this deck's going to be busy with specific copies of Tidebinder coming in, more Tidebinders. You're going to want that in that matchup. Exercise is another new tool as well that you might want for this matchup, considering all the enchantments. One tip for Azorius pilots is I have confirmed in playtesting and with others that Stainful Stroke does counter the impend side of the Overlords, regardless of whether they pay the cheaper cost or not. So for the domain decks that are starting to utilize, especially the white and green ones, this could be an option in the sideboard for that as well. So there are definitely cards in the matchup that give Control a little bit more footing in terms of what they can do to counter domain.
That's fair. And I also think, as you mentioned earlier, like Unwanted Remake, this is the deck that's best positioned to deal with it, right? Because you have the Instant Wraths, because you have Beza, which laughs when it gives them extra creatures. You know what I mean? Like, they get a 2/2 and you're like, fantastic, play one more creature and I get 2/1/1 tokens to block it. Don't care. And it plays the Overlord. That's a 2/1. 2/2/1s that each of them can block a single target for Unwanted Remake. So I can see why it runs it. I think it's a very narrow removal spell, but this is the perfect archetype for it, as you addressed. That said, let's look at another deck that decided to just ignore the new set. So, Golgari Talent.
All right, Sir Hamilton won Smash through the Big Brain Games 24-player tournament on Sunday. Going with the old, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? As they played Golgari Talent with 0 cards from Duskmourn, but let's discuss anyway. We don't have any changes to discuss. The deck is already positioned with, being able to respond with must-answer threats. It's got the must-answer threats already. It's got Glissa. It's got your Deep Cavern Bats. I mean, it already knows what it's doing. Add to that some players have already added Unstoppable Slasher. So whether you're playing Glissa or Unstoppable Slasher or Preacher of the Schism, there are must-answer threats in the deck. This deck is what it is. The deck is already positioned well as well against enchantments with Terra Sunder, Frillback. These do help to supplement the attack there. And then we've also got in the sideboard copies of Soul Guide Lantern, which is still arguably, if not the best, graveyard hate card you can have, especially against Reanimator, along with Frillback. So it's ready to respond to the new meta, which is very enchantment and graveyard play heavy.
And I think there will be more cards that come in, right? Like, this was opening weekend, and a lot of people that just wanted to win tournaments went with the tried and true, knowing that everybody else would be trying other stuff that may or may not pan out, but unless somebody breaks the format, they're going to probably have issues with archetypes that are already proven. So I think there's room to evolve, especially you were talking about Unstoppable Slasher. This is a deck that could absolutely go that direction if it wants to. So we'll see how it pans out over time, but clearly it's still got chops even with all the new cards coming in. That said, we're going to go ahead and take a look at my favorite segment every week, Brewer's Corner. Max, we're going to go ahead and kick things off here momentarily with a little Boros Cinderella.
Credit to Rebellion member Cody Whittaker. Love that name, by the way. Boros Cinderella. This is one of those decks that's starting to gain popularity as more and more people are discovering that you can toss some things into the good old Mighty Mouse kind of archetype. So here's some key cards. Sheltered by Ghosts. This is going to be your key to beating the Slickshot mirrors. This card, going white, interestingly, is wow. I mean, the lifelink, the ward too, but the lifelink especially. Life gain is a great thing to do against prowess, against your Slickshot decks, your mono reds. We've got Cheeky House Mouse. Really needed a third 1cc creature that doubles as kind of pump and evasion. So that versatility, it's enough margins to get over your opponents. Shard Mage's Rescue as well, new card, makes it really difficult to counter this deck on the turn they go for the win. So keeping one of those in your hand, that can really seal it. And then, of course, we have access to Doorkeeper Throw on the sideboard. Since this deck doesn't really take advantage of ETBs, it's a deck that can play Doorkeeper Throw, and there are a lot of other decks, especially new ones right now, that are relying on the ETBs. So,
and this deck feels great as long as they're not running a bunch of copies of Nowhere to Run. You know what I mean? Like, if they have a bunch of copies of Nowhere to Run, you're Sheltered by Ghost, your Shard Mage's Rescue start looking real rough. But if they're not on that, this deck is difficult to interact with. And what I like most about it, Max, is that it's there to beat the Slickshot mirror. Like, Sheltered by Ghosts is so good in the Slickshot mirror. It's so good. It's insanely good. So I like where that's at, and hence the title, Cinderella. But we're going to go ahead and move it right along, and let's talk a little bit about Gruul Delirium. Alrighty, so I'm going to give myself credit for porting this to Standard. I don't remember who had the Pioneer build, but I took it and shifted it over to Standard, ran it in the tournament, ended up 9th on tiebreakers, which was a bit of a bummer. But it's good. It's good. It's got a lot of chops to it that I didn't expect to see. Your Fear of Missing Out, aka FOMO, acts as the second set of 4 cards that give you Double Strike. And people don't really think about that because it doesn't technically register as Double Strike, but if you get Delirium, you're going to get to hit twice with any of the creatures, not just the mice. And if you get to hit with Delirium, that all of a sudden becomes 8 points of damage with a Fear of Missing Out. That's not small, and that's haste. You add in the fact that you have cards like Audacity that we've kind of wanted to play with Heartfire Hero for a while, but like it seems a little risky. And in this one, you don't mind if it goes to the grave. It just adds to Delirium. I also love Breakout. This card is so much fun, especially with Manifold Mouse. The number of times you just get to find a mouse, push it into play, and then dump a Monstrous Rage or an Audacity and swing for 6 to 10 points. It's nuts when it works. It really is.
Wow, that's insane. So what tournament was that you were a part of?
It was the Big Brain Arena tournament. It was over the weekend.
Okay.
Athena and I were rocking it out. The Golgari Talent deck was actually what took it all down in the end.
Interesting. Okay, an argument for not changing at all. But
right.
We're not here to talk about that. Let's talk about change and talk about Rakdos Braids. Credit to Mr. Crocodile, 8th place at the 102-player tournament that we mentioned earlier in Japan. Wow, what are we doing here? This is wild. Look at this curve. Just this card right here. What am I looking at? Disturbing Mirth, Final Vengeance, Clockwork Percussionist. These are huge upgrades for the archetype, really bringing Rakdos Sacrifice. I was wondering if Rakdos Sacrifice was going to be a thing. This card in particular, Disturbing Mirth especially, but Pyroclasm in the sideboard. I just want to point out, this is something that people are overlooking. Pyroclasm is a response to a lot of decks right now, especially your go fast aggro archetypes. You're seeing Azorius Enchantress as well as a new deck. So as a response to a lot of those go fast archetypes that we're seeing, I like Pyroclasm. And then, of course, 4 copies of Leyline in the Void as well. Nobody's really running this. I don't know why, but Graveyard Hate, very important right now. And this Leyline that gets it done, as we've seen in other formats like Pioneer. So don't overlook these cards. Don't overlook this archetype.
Yeah, I mean, if you have Leyline, turn 0 against Reanimator, they basically just sit there until they can kill it. They have no other game plan. They just have to sit there and wait until they can cast enchantment removal. If you get 2 of them, good luck. Good luck on them ever catching up at that point. So I do love that because it does such a good job. The problem it can have is obviously that if you can't slam that door shut fast enough, they'll eventually get rid of it and get their game plan started. But it's a deck that absolutely knows how to slam that door shut. So with that said, let's move on to our final brew, Naya Control. I'm going to butcher the name. I'm so sorry. Credit to Denge Kidaikon, top 8 of the 102-player Is It Explosive Experiment event in Japan. This is the Overlord Beanstalk plan. For those of you who are unaware, you play Beanstalk on 2, you play this Overlord on 3, it will trigger Beanstalk because the mana value is 5. Same with playing this on 4. Again, mana value is 5. You will draw a ton of cards in this. And this, to me, is kind of where that Boros Tokens list, where the Mono White Control list could go if they want to. Not saying it's correct, saying it's an option. Because you still get kind of the best of that world with the Caretaker's Talents and the Urbrask's Forges and the Sunfalls, but you get to go into a hardcore advantage engine with the Beanstalks. You get the ramp plan with Overlord. You get the top end with Herd, because you only need one Overlord to push through to get Herd up to full 5, right? And in the meantime, you only have to run, I think this only runs 23 land. Yeah, 23 land, wow. Because it's got the Bushwhacks, the Analyzed Pollens, and the Herd Migrations, along with the Beanstalks cycle. It's got some chops. It's got some chops. I think it loses to anybody running Jason, anybody running a mill strategy. And clearly, this player was hurt by any Reanimator because they've got 4 Calamity's Wakes and 2 Rest in Pieces. Like, somebody got sick of losing to Squirming Emergence. I can guarantee that. But it's good. It's a decent list. I like where it went.
I like what the Japanese meta oftentimes will produce. It's just these alternatives to decks that we play all the time and just get used to seeing, and then they come out with something. And it's like hard to respond right away because you don't know exactly what you're playing against at first. So right. Yeah, I dig the chops on this Naya Control list.
Fair. And that's going to bring us to our final segment, Ahead of the Curve. So our weekly segment to synthesize all of our analysis into 2 viable tournament options. And Max, we looked at 12 archetypes in our recap. What are you playing going into week 2 of Duskmourn Standard?
So I'm going to an archetype that I didn't give a shot to the first time it came around, but now that we've got some new tools, I'm playing Boros Tokens. First, I want to highlight Torch to the Tower, exile-based removal. This card's putting in a lot of work right now, so I just went ahead and put a full play set in there, especially considering how much prowess, how much aggro we're seeing. And then Helix plus the Obliterating Bolt here, also more fuel to deal with the fire that is prowess, really to blow it up, and then put in your own tempo them, put in your own board state. So I like Helix where it's positioned, especially because of the life gain. Get Lost, again, versatile, instant speed removal. I would decide to go with this over a card like Exercise, basically because of the fact that it's instant speed and very versatile. We've got Forge, we've got Elspeth, Jaya, and Wanderer as our token generators this time around, in addition to Overlord of the Mistmoors, which works really great in Control, especially because we're able to pop it for the impending cost, do some things, and then it comes in and gives you the effect twice. I love that. This deck is really positioned well for the meta, in my opinion, because you're able to take control of the board state and then apply your own. You're not worried about, board wiping. You're not worried about some of the things that people do to counter the creature-based decks. It is a control list, but it's very versatile in the sense that it's going to take over the board and really win in the end game. And again, just point out Pyroclasm is in here as well. Don't overlook that card. I saw this card come in. I was very excited, especially when we were seeing a heavy aggro summer. So I like where the deck is positioned.
And honestly, Max, I'm curious if Pyroclasm's presence has just scared off the Convoke players, because I didn't see Convoke basically anywhere over this last weekend, which makes me wonder if everybody saw, where things were going to go, and they're like, Pyroclasm, we're done. We're done. We're not doing it. That said, let's talk a little bit about the deck that I would choose, Zur's Domain Fixed. So we talked a little bit about this earlier. How do you make Domain to actually deal with aggro while not losing all of the grind, all of the parity? This is how I would do it. Okay, I would cut out a lot of the top end and say we are going to play the 4 line of bindings. We're going to do that. We're also going to focus pretty heavily on getting rid of those Cavern of Souls and getting Fabled Passages so that we have better lands as the game goes on and correct mana early on. Lastly, Temporary Lockdown. I'm just going to play it as a playset. I'm just going to do that to start. Until we see the aggro menace start to go back, I'm going to play this. And here's the thing. You may look at that and go, okay, but what does it do against the other mid-range decks? Well, with Zur, it turns into a 3/3 with Death Touch, Lifelink, Hexproof. So it's not dead like it used to be. Zur allows that to be so much more. And this deck, I put it like this. I displayed it like this so you could see that this is what the curve actually kind of looks like. As much as we want us to be like, oh, it's a 7-drop and a 5-drop. Nah, it's a 3-drop. It's a 4-drop. honestly, this is going to come down on 3 most of the time. So I think the mana base here probably still needs some work, but overall, I really like where this is positioned, and I'm 1-0 so far on the ladder.
Cool. As I said before, happy to see these are back in the mix. Awesome. But that's another week in the books. Thank you for supporting us. And really, I want to give a special shout out to our members who support us by watching these videos every week and all the way through. Thank you so much. We'll be back next week with more analysis.
Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment on this video. Please remember, every click helps. Every click matters. Every click helps the rebellion. Until next time, Rebels, untap, upkeep, resist.